Hey, David Brewster here with an episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Mastodon. And Mastodon formed in Atlanta, Georgia in the year 2000, so I can't believe they've been around for 20 years. But definitely they kind of, I became familiar with the band when they released the album Leviathan in 2004. And I heard there was a metal band that released a Moby Dick themed, album. And I was like, what? Who's Mastodon? What Moby Dick? And I checked it out, and I really dug it. Leviathan's awesome. They followed that with Blood Mountain, and then about 11 years ago, they released Crack the Skye, that album. And when I bought that album and put it on, I was just hooked. It was like progressive metal. It had this atmosphere, this depth, in their sound. And I don't know, I just became obsessed with the group. It was about 11 years ago. And that's when I finally dove into Mastodon. It took me a little while. And then I definitely went back and checked out Remission, like their first album from 2002. And I've definitely been following, their more recent albums, The Hunter and some of the more recent albums they put out. Definitely a great band. I love the textures and chords and this dreamy ambience that they kind of have in some of their music. And of course they riff out and start rocking and thrashing and everything else. But I love the textures, the interesting chords and the moods and that big, atmospheric sound. I'm a sucker for it. Mastodon itself, it is kind of an interesting band. I don't really know how you would define or label the group, and I really don't like putting labels on music, but it does kind of serve a purpose, if you're trying to explain it to somebody or just explain the sound of a group or an album or whatever. So it's definitely progressive metal, but I've heard them, referred to as experimental metal and psychedelic metal, stoner rock, stoner metal, groove metal. I mean, I've heard all these different, terms, but there's definitely a prog thing happening, especially around the Crack the Skye album. And they've kind of continued that focus in that direction too in more recent albums. But there's definitely a prog thing, and there's obviously a metal thing. But they do kind of have this light and dark, kind of contrast where certain songs are very melodic and kind of flowing and dreamlike. And then the next song, it's like Armageddon and a volcano erupting or whatever, where it's like, oh my gosh. So they definitely kind of go both ways. And I like that, where it's clean and kind of pretty 1 minute. And then it's just this netherworld of, metal riffs and heavy, heavy sounds. But I like that dynamic, kind of moving back and forth between those worlds. The opening, that was the song The Hunter from the album with the same name. And the first time I ever heard that song, it just grabbed me because I love those chords. It had that haunting, kind of mysterious sound. Something like this. And I just love that. It's awesome. And, it starts off and you're basically implying D minor major 11 right here. That right there. So that's a very unusual chord, D minor major 11. And then when you open up that high E string, it becomes a D minor major 9. And then right there, you're going to basically, play the high E and slide into the 8th and 10th fret on the B and the G string. So that's basically like a C sus4, and then C major, and then a little piece of D minor right here. So that's really unusual, but I love that progression. And then you repeat it again. right there at the very end, that's basically like a D minor add 9 at the end, which is really cool with that high E open. But there's just something really special about those chords. I love the progression. You know, it has that haunted, kind of suspenseful sound. And a great song too. But I love that guitar part. The next example is from the song Trainwreck, which is from their first album, Remission, and it also creates this haunting kind of unusual sound. I really like it. So right there, we're basically flirting with C major 7 and B major 7. And it's kind of unusual to hear those two chords back to back like that. But that's exactly what's happening. So it walks into the C major 7. And then you're going to move down to this, and that's basically functioning as B major 7. So it creates this interesting clash, you know, between those two chords. But I like that unsettled, you know, kind of dark sound. Really cool. You know, and it's really simple, but you don't really have to play something hard to make it sound haunted or unusual or kind of dark. You can create, you know, those atmospheric worlds really simply just by using, you know, some select chords and kind of letting the notes ring or kind of blur into each other. And I really am a big fan of that kind of stuff. Next we have the song Stargasm, which is from The Hunter, and it looks like this. Right there, we're basically, we are tuned down a whole step, and we're also in drop D, so it's kind of like drop C tuning. Something like that. So just tune your low E string down an additional whole step, and you're in drop C, technically. When you play that, just think of Hendrix, you know, like Third Stone from the Sun. And then right there, there's a melodic line, and then it's going to move into this. And that's basically a B flat major 7. And then that A note's going to move back to a G, and that's going to change that to a B flat 6. Like that. And then the second time it just stops on that B flat major 7. Something like that. And then the song kind of changes right there, and it starts moving into it starts moving into that territory, and that's really cool because that's like a D sus2 and then a D minor sharp 5 right there. So it starts kind of playing with that little half step movement in those chords. You know, it's a really interesting song though. I love that tune. Alright, up next we have the song Oblivion from Crack the Skye, and it looks something like this. There, I kind of condensed the riffs just to kind of move through all those different parts, because I love how it starts with one initial idea and then they include that idea and start throwing in power chords and they flesh out the rest of the riff. Really cool. So it's starting with this, and that's kind of functioning like a D flat 9. Because there's your E flat, and then you're targeting that open D string. And then you do that again, and then you play the open D and the open low D, because we're still tuned down a whole step and then drop D too. And just hit that low E, and then do it again. And then right there at the end, just hit, you know, a 7th fret harmonic on the low E, and you've got the opening. So right there's where we're kind of combining that riff with power chords. And that's crafty, I like that. Then it moves up here and you're basically flirting with this F. So that change is really unusual. I really dig that riff because it's hitting, you know, some really unsettled and unusual tonalities, but then they kind of started, you know, dancing around it with power chords. They even kind of extended it up into that F move there. So I like that, how they're kind of fleshing that riff out. Really cool. Next up we have the song The Sparrow, which is from The Hunter, and it looks like this. And we're back in standard, you know, down a whole step. So we're not in drop C, you know, or drop D tuning down a whole step. So this is just regular down a whole step. So it's really interesting, and I like that intricate kind of chord work that Mastodon always seems to have in their songs. So it starts off, and this is really unusual, and I've seen some transcriptions of this online, and they're all a little bit different. But when I hear the song, I hear the notes kind of overlapping and ringing into each other. And I kind of found a way to play it like that. Which to me, that sounds right. It sounds like the album. The other versions of it that I've seen, you know, stuff like that, it doesn't really sound right. To me, that sounds pretty close. So that's basically E minor. And then right there, you're going to pull off that F sharp. And it actually ends up being a kind of a good, you know, fretboard exercise or a workout, you know, kind of keeping, you know, the notes held down while you're kind of pulling off with that third finger. That's tricky, you know, to get that little third finger to cooperate there. And then this is really interesting. This is kind of signaling like a B minor add 11. So right there, there's kind of an interesting use of an open string pull-off in there too. Like that, and it creates this kind of melodic line. Even though you're just kind of picking through that chord, but that's cool. And that's a tricky guitar part. It doesn't look like there's much happening, but once you start to kind of flesh out those parts, it's tricky to keep that going, you know, cleanly. The last example comes from the song Sea Beast from Leviathan, and it looks like this. You know, and it has these sick, crazy, psychotic chords. But that first shape right here, that's basically a B minor sharp 11. And then you're going to move that basically up to D, and that's going to change that to a D6 sharp 11. Chords that fit right in a horror movie. That's very suspenseful and just chaotic, but I love it. Of course, that lead comes in, and I believe it's Brent, but he starts doing... it creates that really dark, just ominous sound, but I love that. It's so cool. That's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with the Chords of Mastodon, and definitely I've been a fan for about, 11, 12 years or so. I wasn't really, listening to them when they first hit the scene. It took me a little while. I heard about Moby Dick, with Leviathan, and then I heard Blood Mountain, and I liked it. I think just at that time, I wasn't really listening to music like that. But then in 2009, when Crack the Skye came out, I was listening to Lamb of God, and I was listening to a lot of metal. And that just fell in my lap like a gift, from the gods or whatever, where it was like, yes, this is awesome. And then I became a fan. And then I started buying more of their albums, and I went back. And then I've definitely listened and bought each album, since then. And they're a dynamic, interesting, kind of different, unusual band. I do like the kind of just random, kind of ADD, approach where, every album, every song, everything that they kind of do is a little different, and they have a lot of different areas they can kind of explore. And I like that, where it's not just one thing, it's like 100 different things, and you never really know what it's gonna, sound like when they put it together. So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.